So, what's it feel like being on the verge of being 100 years old?
Well, at first I hadn't thought much about it, so it was kind of confusing maybe. But I thought it would be neat because I had a grandmother who was 4 months from being 100. And my mother was 89 when she passed away. My dad was 90. So I thought maybe there's some longevity there. But then I had to think again, the question that many people were asking was, why do you think you live so long? And my answer, of course, was, I don't know. But I started thinking then about the age of my parents and my grandparents, and I thought, well, maybe that's it. And then I thought, when I was born in Nebraska, in the middle of the middle of the winter, in the middle of the night, on a little farm outside of a little town in Nebraska. And I've had a pretty good life and a pretty good health. And it's just been a lot of interest. 4 kids that were very good. I love them very much. And my husband and I were married 66 years. And when we celebrated our golden wedding anniversary, we went to a restaurant in West Seattle. And when we left, the owner of the establishment ran out and said, I have to tell you this. The waiter, who looked to be about 20 years old, said that he heard those people, those old people out there that had been married for 50 years. And then he said, and to one person. So we always kind of treasure that little gem. But
People always ask. This is such a cliche question, but it's so you don't have like one secret to be longevity, like every morning you have grape nuts or something like that.
no, I don't. But the doctor told me, just look at the fresh air, exercise, when you see all the things I planted around the house. I got interested in rhododendrons when we moved to Seattle from Southern California. And so I was able to go out with 11 other people and spend 3 weeks photographing rhododendrons in China. And then we went to the Himalayas. Then I went twice and spoke to rhododendron people in New Zealand. My husband went with me on those trips. On the China trip and the Himalayan trip, he said, I'm not a camper. And he wouldn't go. But we went to New Zealand. He wanted to see that because he'd been there during the war. And always said it was such a beautiful country, he'd like to look at it again sometime. So that's, I don't know really what to tell you.
Well, gardening is kind of good.
What brought you up from Southern California?
Well, when I was 12 years old, my father, who was a postmaster in Nebraska, lost his job as one of those political things. And we moved to Southern California, where all the people in the little town that we lived in Nebraska would go for their vacations. And they'd come back with these glowing stories about Southern California. So my father wanted to see it, so we sold our house, packed up, and went to California. And as luck would have it, a couple of years after we were there was another exam came up for a postmaster in Lomita, California. My dad took it, he won, and for 40 years he was postmaster.
Wow.
He retired 2 days before he turned 80. So we lived there a long time. I liked it. My mother wasn't so happy with it, but she said the holidays never seemed like holidays there. Christmas, New Year's, things like that. And also she was one of 11 children, and she didn't want to be that far away from her family. But of course, years later, as they scattered, she was much happier in California. So
So when did you wind up leaving California then?
After World War II, my husband's parents were from Seattle,
Oh.
and we came up for a vacation. The war was over. My husband said he would never go to sea again, and he didn't. But he did work around the waterfront for years. But we came up here, and for 4 years we were going to go back to California. We were going home. But we went home and we lasted 1 week. And my husband came home from work on a Friday night and said, I don't like the company I'm working for. I think they're doing something illegal. I just don't want to get involved. I haven't lived or worked there long enough to know what it is. So let's go back to Seattle. And that's when we did. That was around 1950 when we were here for several years.
And you've been in West Seattle that whole time?
No, we lived over near Magnolia for a year, just over in Hoop. And we lived out in Burien for about a year. We had one child when we lived there. The other 3 were born here in Seattle. So it's kind of an interesting life in a way. I never dreamed of going to China or anything like that. But it happened. We went to Scotland and Ireland and Wales. And my husband had been, during the war, his ship hit an iceberg. And they managed to drop out of the convoy, patch up the ship, and they made it to Liverpool. And he was in Liverpool for 6 months while they worked on the ship. And one of the fellows that was an officer with him had worked for Lloyd's of London in California. So he, one day when they had a week off, or I think maybe it was a weekend, he said, I have never been to see the building, the place in London where the insurance company is established. And he said, why don't we go up? You go with me. And this man was quite a bit older than my husband. But they went over there, and the people in the building were so happy to see them, so happy to see Americans in the war areas as they were. And one of the fellows had a mansion in Wales. And his family lived there during the war. It wasn't bombed much there.
Mm.
So they went over, I think, 2 different times. And he was telling me that the minute they crossed the line from England into Wales, everybody that got on the bus began to sing. They sang in Welsh language, they sang in English, and every time they made a stop until they got to the place where they were going to get off, whoever came on the bus would sit down and start to sing. And he said they had beautiful voices. And it was just kind of a pleasure in the middle of war.
Well, and I wonder if they were singing in Welsh, because that's an amazing language with so many consonants struck. My grandmother's from Wales, so I...
Well, he said they couldn't understand anything. And actually there was some Welsh in my father's family, and when they lived on the farm, these Welsh people would come to visit. And he said their language they spoke was like the clucking of geese. And he said I would run to the barn and I would stay there till they left.
It's crazy. The rhododendron travel must have been really something.
It was. The first trip to China, a airline pilot for the old Northwest Airlines took us there. His son, Rob, apparently had been to Japan for years back and forth. And whenever he had a few days off, he'd go someplace nearby where rhododendrons grew. So he decided to take a little party there, and he approached me because he knew I was interested. But the first thing he said to me was, "Do you smoke?" And I said, "No, Warren, I've never smoked." And he said, "Why don't you come with us?" So I think if I had said I did. I don't think I would have ever been invited to go. But we were all in Yunnan province, which is kind of southern in China. And we actually saw more tribes people than we did Han Chinese. But they were very friendly. It was very nice. We were there for 3 weeks, and one of the places called 99 Dragon Pool. And that was, we had a little incident there that was very nice. One of our ladies was not feeling well in there, so she decided to stay in camp for the day. And the cooks made a lunch for her, but she said, I didn't feel like eating that lunch. So there was a goat herder, a man that came by our camp every day in the morning and went home in the late afternoon. And she caught him, I guess, in the morning and gave him her lunch. And the next morning when she got up and she looked outside her tent, there was a big bouquet of flowers. Well, later on we followed the stream and we saw where he cut the flowers, but it was such a nice thing to do. And when we left, we gave him some little gifts, which we weren't supposed to do. I have to say, Chinese said no gifts. You don't give anybody anything. But I gave a pen, I think it was, something simple like that. He knew how to use these things. And so it was fun to be able to give him something.
Where'd you learn about the rhododendrons?
When I came here in the 1950s, I went to a big show that they had at the university, and I saw rhododendrons, all sizes, beautiful things. I had never seen anything like that in California. So I went to a nursery and looked around, and then eventually I joined the American Rhododendron Society and went on tours and that sort of thing. It was fun, lots of conventions.
Do you still tend the ones in your garden, or do you have help doing that? Or?
I do as much as I can, but I have to say I can't do as much as I used to. I do a lot of on my knees now and on my bottom, where I used to be able to stand up and bend over. So I'm very careful. I had a fall about 8 years ago because I overreached something that I was going to prune, and there was nothing to grab. So I just fell on the cement out here, and it was kind of painful to my shoulder, but I didn't have a concussion or anything like that. But it made me be careful.
Yeah. So do you still take walks and things? You were mentioning about the fresh air being a...
Oh yeah. Well, I have what I call a walking stick. I was told to call it that, not a cane. And so I go around the neighborhood, with the cane. I carry it with me everywhere I go in a car. And so I always have some support if I need it. In the house here on level ground, I can still walk. In fact, one of the nurses, I do have an eye problem now. One of the nurses asked me, did I do any exercises? And a friend of ours is a retired physical therapist, and he gave me a little list of exercises to do. He said, if you do these every day, you'll be able to walk a lot longer. And he's right.